Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midwest and Great Plains Climate Drought Outlook for July 17th, 2014. And our briefer today is Dr. Dennis Toddy. He's with South Dakota State University, and he is the state climatologist there and one of their premier teachers and professors. Dennis, it's all yours.
Thanks, John. Gee, you've called me premier now, and now I actually have to do something well. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome to everyone. We are reaching the middle part of July here, typically very warm time of year climatologically throughout the whole area, but we are actually experiencing somewhat cooler temperatures as there was a cold pool moved down over us over the last several days, giving us a nice dry and cool respite from our typical midsummer heat, which is, well, we'll talk about some of the impacts agriculturally. I was just thinking as we started here that the calling it a climate drought forum, we should probably remove most of the drought from this time because in our region we don't have that. We have some severe areas, but not very much drought to talk about overall. So the image we're showing you starting off here is comes to us compliments of Josh Boosted from the National Weather Service in Omaha, showing some of our hail damage. This is a hail damaged tree. This is not fall, and this is not dead. This was a tree that was completely defoliated and bark taken off of it. So a very impressive amount of hail that has damaged here. Some general information. Again, this is a regional climate services project in collaboration among state climatologists, the regional climate centers, NOAA, and National Weather Service, of trying to capitalize on all of our different capabilities to present current information and outlook information for people to use throughout the region. Our next webinar will be August 21st, the third Thursday of the month, always at 1 p.m. And our presenter is a new presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Andreessen from Michigan State, the Michigan State climatologist. So he will be presenting next time around. Also a reminder that these are archived and saved, so that you can go back and look at them at any time, pass them on to other people. And we ask, could you please do that? We want to get as wide a use of these as possible. Our agenda for today, as usual, current conditions, what's our situation right now, some of the impacts. There are some interesting different impacts, not as many as we've had some other years or other times, but there are some impacts going on right now, and then we'll touch on the outlooks and where we are with El Nino. And then we will have time for questions at the end of this, of course. Okay, kind of review and our current conditions of where we are right now. See if we can get this to advance here. Kind of a June temperature recap where we were on a statewide basis. This comes to us from the National Climatic Data Center, indicating the rank for each state for the month of June, the calendar month of June. You can see the pinkish color in the eastern part of the region, and numbers in the 80s to 90s, actually above normal temperatures for the month of June around the Great Lakes and the eastern Corn Belt. In the Central Plains and in Iowa, closer to average temperatures. And then you see some blue areas in the Northern Plains with slightly below average temperatures for the month of June. Kind of an interesting setting overall that we were looking at here. The ranking number there goes from 1 to 120 years now, so the lower the number, the lower on the scale, the higher the number, the higher on the scale. Looking also at the June precipitation, part of the reason for the cooler temperatures in the Northern Plains was relatively wet conditions, and this was probably the bigger news item of the month of June and has been the big news item over the last 6 weeks or so, has been heavy precipitation in parts of the region, which we're going to talk about some of the impacts here in just a little bit. Again, the ranking scale, and you see throughout most of the area above to well above normal, and according to NCDC ranks, Minnesota would come in as the record wettest June on record. A number of other states you can see are in the 100 teens area. So top 5 for South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa for top 5 wettest Junes. Then a number of other wetter places around it. You see further out to the west in the plains, closer to average temperature or precipitation totals, and down into Kentucky, so not quite as wet in those areas. And this wetness has had some very significant impacts, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Some record wet precipitation totals, South Dakota did set a state record highest monthly total ever in Canton, South Dakota, where we had 19.75 inches of precipitation. Minnesota did have a CoCoRaHS report of, I believe, over 22 inches, though there was some question about the total, so it will probably not be passed on as for a record, but likely above 20 inches at that location. Moving on to the most recent 30 days now, as we get a little closer, since we're in the middle of the month now. Temperatures in the upper left hand, and this is again over our whole region from Montana in the upper left down to Kentucky in the lower right. Average temperatures here, and then more importantly, the departure from average temperatures in the lower right hand side. The places that are in greens are up to 2 degrees below average. The blues to purples are 2 to 4 degrees below average. So you can see generally cooler than average conditions throughout most of the region over the last 30 days. That does then include this recent several days of cool temperatures. In the far eastern part of the Corn Belt, slightly above average temperatures, and down into Kansas, parts of Kansas and Colorado, slightly above average temperatures down there too, partially associated with the ongoing drought conditions they have. For these cooler conditions typically are a good scenario to have for agriculture in the Corn Belt. In the main part of the Corn Belt, a little bit cooler than average temperatures in the middle part of the summer is good for crop productivity. In the far northern part of the Corn Belt, where we're running a little bit behind, a little bit delayed planting, those cooler temperatures are not as good. We're needing more heat in those areas. Moving on to the most recent 30 days for precipitation, you can see a very significant feature right in the middle of the map, total precipitation on the upper left-hand side again, and then departure from normal in the lower right. And you can very clearly see the purple area over far southeastern South Dakota through Iowa to northern Illinois, even parts of Michigan, running 3 to up to 7 inches above average for the last 30 days, which has had some significant impacts on agriculture in those areas, helping to add to the flooding issues we've seen, and created some overall wet conditions. You can see also pockets of dryness, though, with several inches below average precipitation totals from northern Minnesota down to south-central South Dakota, and then an area from eastern Kansas through Missouri and off into the eastern Corn Belt. So we do have some areas that are starting to dry out as we are reaching the middle part of our growing season here. And then we're going to zoom in a little bit now to the last 14 days. We went from 30 days down to the last 14 days. You can see that very wet period happened, but now in the last 14 days we've actually started to dry out fairly quickly in some locations. Again, precipitation upper left-hand side, departure from average in the lower right. And you can see that over the last 14 days we've actually been running drier than average throughout most northern areas, still a little wetter than average in pockets from Nebraska over to Illinois and Michigan. How that's impacting us is it's from the very wet areas that's been a positive because it gives them a chance to drain and to dry out a little bit. But then the areas that are somewhat dry, we are ones we're watching for potential development of some problems, at least a little stress on crops as we approach this very warm period coming up, which we'll talk about here a little bit later. The crops have also been being helped out by the reduced ET or evapotranspiration. When you have cooler than average temperatures, that reduces the amount of crop water use you have, and so that even if you are a little bit dry, it reduces the amount of stress on crops, so there's been an advantage that way. And then putting this all together in a couple maps here, the 7-day average stream flow, you see lots of blue throughout most of the region, even some black in Illinois there, indicating highest stream flow on record for this time of year. Blue areas indicating above the 90th percentile. So lots of water, as you would expect, because of the precipitation throughout the region. A few areas in the eastern Corn Belt, northern Kansas that are running a little on the dry side. Most everywhere else, quite a bit of water available right now. Interesting contrast, though, as we show a soil moisture map. This is from the NLDAS system, which is an ensemble of different soil moisture models. This shows you the current soil moisture anomaly. This is in millimeters, so you have to divide by 25 to get inches of soil moisture below or above average. So the darker blue, here we have 1 to 2 to 4 inches above average soil moisture, and then in the yellow to red colors, 1 to 2 to 4 inches below average soil moisture. So you see some things that you would expect. Parts of Iowa, wetter than average soil moisture, Minnesota up in the Dakotas and Montana, which have been quite wet, above average soil moisture. But you see areas of southern Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, are still showing up as drier than average, which is kind of interesting given the amount of precipitation we've had in certain parts of those areas. And then you look down to eastern Kansas, Missouri, and parts of southern Illinois, running a little bit on the dry side, as we showed with some of the precipitation going on right now. So something we have to keep an eye on. Also, we have to take with a grain of salt. These are models. They're not ground truth because we don't have ground truth information to compare them to. But it's kind of interesting, the differences we see as we look at these different maps. Okay, bringing this all together, the most recent U.S. Drought Monitor map released this morning. That was valid Tuesday morning, and you see lots of white, basically indicating that there's very little drought issue across most of the region. You see a few pockets of yellow here and there indicating abnormally dry conditions, not much impact. You still see some areas of more severe drought from Nebraska into Kansas, eastern Colorado, and even a little bit in far southeastern Kentucky. These are still carryover issues from last several years of drought. Some of these places have started having some precipitation, which is good, but there's been the ongoing discussion on the Drought Monitor folks of how quickly they can show improvement, because even a few inches of rain at this point doesn't solve your issue. It just starts you down the road of improvement. And for people who have seen some pictures from eastern Colorado and western Kansas, there are some very, very poor-looking places that are looking very Dust Bowl-like in those locations. Okay, kind of catches you up on the current conditions and where we are right now. So we're going to look at some of the impacts, review some of the issues that we've had going on over the last month or so. And there we go. First one we're going to look at is some of the agricultural impacts. It's been a very interesting growing season. The wet in the spring did slow some planting down, especially further north. But from a crop progress standpoint right now, from a corn progress, the areas that are in green are ahead, and what we'll consider here is silking, that tasseling time. It's a very important reproductive time, has a big impact on corn yield. You see the areas in green are ahead of actual development a little bit, or in Missouri and Illinois actually quite a bit ahead of their 5-year average. You see up further to the north, you see places that are behind average, especially Minnesota and North Dakota, Michigan, Wisconsin, where conditions were relatively wet and cool in the spring, delayed planting. And then you have also areas of Ohio, which I think were also running somewhat wet and delayed some of the crop progress. Iowa, which has had some wet conditions, really is still pretty good in the way of their crop progress. Looking at soybeans, this is even more interesting. You see the typical North Dakota, Minnesota, where crop progress is behind, but you see throughout most of the big part of the soybean growing areas, especially Nebraska and South Dakota, well ahead of average progress in the way of soybeans for this time of year. Even Illinois and Indiana, there's quite a bit of progress well ahead of where we would expect them to be at this time of year. Overall, crop conditions are, and I guess other crops we didn't include, wheat is reaching harvesting stage. Some other small grains are starting to be harvested. Generally, crop conditions have been quite good. There are local areas where things are not as good. Some of those wetter areas in the northern Corn Belt have suffered a little bit more, but overall reports have still been quite good. And generally crop progress has been better than expected. I thought we would be a little bit further behind than we were at this point, but still going along fairly well. Again, the northern area, some delayed planting, wet conditions are slowing things down. Unless we can get some overall heat moving them along, they'll probably have some problems reaching maturity or harvesting some higher moisture corn. This cool stretch that we've had, which people have been taking note of and caught some media attention, probably overall has been pretty good for the most of the Corn Belt, because again, that tasseling time, a lot of corn reaching tasseling, cooler temperatures are actually good for it overall. again, variable development in wetter areas, and then there's been a fair amount of hail and severe weather damage. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Just one product to point to for those of you who may be interested. Several state climatologists are part of a regional project through Purdue University, and the website is listed there below, or you can just Google U2U, useful to usable, and you can find the tool. And this is the growing degree day tool, which is a method of tracking how much heat there has been and showing where they are compared to average. It's a good thing to track crop progress. And this happened to be a place I took from eastern Iowa, with assuming a planting date in mid-April. And these lines show a growing degree day accumulation and where they are compared to average. And what you see, looking at a number of different places across the Corn Belt, is close to average degree day. There's been, despite the little bit cooler temperatures, degree day accumulation or heat accumulation for the crops has actually been close to average. So that's keeping crop progress going along. Okay, moving on to something we often talk about, the Missouri River, with what's going on the Missouri River. Less to talk about in the Missouri River, more on the Mississippi this time, and some general flooding aspects throughout the region with some of the heavier rainfall. Widespread flooding issues on the Mississippi River because of the heavier rainfalls from late May through June led to some increase in flows, large increase in flows on the Mississippi River, which has actually had to stop barge traffic due to locks being closed because of high flows in Iowa and Missouri. There's been some rail traffic diverted because of water over the tracks in Hannibal, Missouri, and other places. There have been some road closures in Minnesota, not on the Mississippi per se, on the Minnesota River and some other locations due to high water, washed out roads and water over roads for a period of time. And back on the Mississippi, they did close some bridges for a while at Quincy, Illinois, and Louisiana, Missouri because of high water in those locations. Also, Greg Spoden from Minnesota passed on information about noting some reduced revenue, some impact because of golf course closures, water over golf courses. A couple in the Twin Cities, they were concerned about them being able to reopen them this summer, which would be a large revenue loss for them. Also, recreation, camping, hiking have been impacted. One of the big ones, or not the big one, but was one state park in Minnesota, which was had a dam break and was ended up being closed for several weeks while they were cleaning up after the dam break. So a number, and the picture on the lower right-hand side, that is from the Quad Cities. Where the boat is actually where the edge of the river is, so you can see the reach of the river getting into downtown. And then also some severe weather impacts. There's been some discussion about, there seems like there's a lot of severe weather, a lot of hail, a lot of damage, a lot of tornadoes. But it is interesting. I plotted out, this is from the Storm Prediction Center, the severe weather reports for the month of June. The red dots are confirmed tornadoes. The blue dots are wind, and green is hail. Or I can't remember. One is green and blue. I can't remember which one is which. I apologize. But there has been a fair amount of severe weather throughout the plains and into the northern Corn Belt, you can see. But when we compare it to the number of reports we've seen other years, I plotted out the total number of June severe weather reports. And these are nationwide, not just for the central region, but we kind of catch the bulk of the severe weather at this time of year. So this plots out those number of severe weather reports from 2007 through 2014 for the month of June. And the total severe reports is the top. This line is the wind reports. The green line is the hail reports. And then the bottom line is tornado reports. And just kind of indicating that 2014 doesn't show up as that much more than some other years. A little bit of an uptick on tornado ones, a little bit of an uptick in both hail and wind. But, well within what we would expect within some of these other years. There was a big drop-off here in hail reports, and that was largely due to the National Weather Service changing their hail criteria. So you start getting fewer large hail reports there because of increasing the size of their hail criteria. So there has been a lot of impact. There's been some severe weather around, but not seemingly untoward compared to some other years. Okay, let's move on to the outlooks right now and kind of review what we can see upcoming and what's going to be happening. We will walk through a quick 7-day precipitation forecast. the 8 to 14-day outlook, the monthly and 3-month outlooks, the seasonal drought outlook, and then we'll touch on El Nino, which is still changing, going to be impacting us, but changing a little bit before our eyes. So from NOAA, National Weather Service, the Weather Prediction Center, just to start this process of projected precipitation over the next week, you can see throughout most of our area, not large amounts of precipitation expected, maybe some north, just to our south, some heavier precipitation amounts, but not a ton of precipitation is expected over the next week. We're also expecting a fairly significant heat event starting in the plains and moving over to the Corn Belt as we get into next week. Probably we'll have some high dew points associated with it too, partially because of the heat, but then also when you've got corn in good condition, along with the heat over it, there's going to be a lot of transpiration of water. So we expect a fairly high dew point episode going on. Just how high, we'll have to kind of wait and see. Moving on to the 8 to 14-day outlook, and these takes us through the end of July. On the left-hand side, temperature probabilities, you can see much of our area is in the near normal. A little cooler expected over the Great Lakes and eastern Corn Belt, a little warmer down to the southwest. I did not show the 6 to 10-day, but if you look at the 6 to 10-day, there would be a bit of a difference, a similar pattern, but a bubble of warm air that is related to that warm event that I mentioned next week. Otherwise, that's about the main difference with that. From a precipitation standpoint, though we're going to likely be somewhat drier, we will see a little bit more pickup in probabilities for precipitation in the eastern part of the region, less so in the western part of the region getting through the end of the month. Jumping ahead to the August outlook, which was just released this morning, same caveats here or explanations. Cooler than average temperatures more likely throughout northern parts of the region. Far southern parts of the region may be a little warmer than average based on outlooks right now. And then more than a better chance of wetter than average in the far western parts and the plains parts. Been well discussed and likely to happen. Computer models are indicating a fairly strong monsoonal signal going on, hence why you see a lot of this in the Four Corners area catching up into the western plains area with better than average chances for precipitation. Jumping ahead to the 3-month outlook, and you see a very similar pattern. A little bit larger area and further south in the way of below average temperature chances throughout a good part of the western part of the Corn Belt. The wetter area is shoved a little further south in this region as we look in the August to October. Some impacts that could be related to this. I mentioned about crop development being in pretty good shape. If we stay on the cool side, that would slow crop development down, so there would be a bit more of a concern about crops reaching maturity or drying out in the field by the time we reach a freeze, especially in northern areas, something we'll have to keep track of. And then how wet we are will bear watching too, because of our areas that are still running quite wet. If we were to continue to stay wet into the fall, that could present some harvest issues in getting out in the field. Hopefully that will not be too much of a problem. Moving on to the drought outlook, our situation looking at our change in the drought pattern as we're going into the end of October, the new seasonal drought outlook. Again, we have very little drought area over us, and so there is not expected to be much increase in that drought area. In fact, the outlook is indicating some removal likely in Kansas and improvement, though not removal, from Colorado over to Kansas. So, and that's related to this above average chances for precipitation expected in this region. Kind of odd for this time of year, but we can use the improvement down in these locations. Now, touching on El Nino, we have ongoing news with El Nino, still moving down the path of expecting to have El Nino, but there has been a slight shift. The lower right-hand side, this is the average sea surface temperatures compared to average, sea surface temperatures compared to average, or the anomaly. And you can see this tongue of warmer water off the coast of South America and the eastern equatorial Pacific, indicative of El Nino conditions. Mainly we are warm enough right now. We have just not sustained that period of warm water probably long enough to be classified as an El Nino. but I think we're in pretty good chance of being able to stay that way. I think the most recent outlook from NOAA was indicating as a 70% chance of being El Nino this summer and 80% chance as we got to into the fall and winter. One little development, though, as we watch this, and the plot on the left-hand side is a loop of the temperature anomaly or subsurface temperatures. And we're looking the same way from the eastern or the western Pacific to the eastern Pacific, but now we're looking at depth below the surface here. And there was a big pool of warmer than average water, which really helped to push off the, what El Nino-like conditions down there. But you can see that is rapidly dissipating. So we'll have to keep an eye on this to see does this mean that the El Nino is weakening and will not be as strong, or is this just a pause? So it's something we have to keep an eye on right now. Still, like we're headed down the path of El Nino, just how strong is probably much more of the consideration right now. And the probabilistic outlook on El Nino, again, reiterates what I said about these are the 3-month periods, June, July, August, September, October, November, November, December, January, and the probabilities, you see El Nino by far is the highest probability throughout these with a much lesser chance of neutral conditions and a very, very small chance of La Nina conditions. Seems like a very, very unlikely scenario at this point. But what that is doing is reflecting our outlooks. Usually we don't look this far ahead, but the impending El Nino is reflected in the outlooks for our winter. Here's December through February outlook throughout the northern tier of the country. Higher than average chances for above average temperatures, which is indicative typically of El Ninos. And then there is a little area of above average chances for precipitation in the central plains, which again is an El Nino composite. So we'll have to keep an eye on these as we go along right now. Also, in the Ohio Valley, there's a fairly well-known dry pocket that occurs during El Nino events. So these are reflected in the outlook for December through February. Okay, to kind of wrap things up, kind of a summary of our current conditions. Generally cool and average over much of the region. Crop development is near average or a little ahead at this point. Overall, we are wetter, but a few locations are dry and beginning to dry out a little bit more. We still have some carryover flood problems, but those are starting to ease finally. Locally, and the Mississippi River is gradually working its way down. We should see easing of those impacts fairly soon here. Agriculture generally in good shape. Pockets of wetness and delayed development, but generally pretty good. I didn't mention anything about fire. Did a little checking on fire, and generally throughout the region, by this time of year, especially in the plains area, we would start expecting some fire concerns. But the overall wetness and relatively cool conditions has generally left us with really minor fire issues. There have been fires started, but they've been relatively small. Conditions have been fairly green, so there have not been too many issues. The main dry areas are in eastern Colorado, western Kansas, but things have been bad down there for several years. There's probably not a ton down there to burn from what I've seen in some pictures. From an outlook standpoint, again, we're going to have a warm and humid stretch in the next week, which bears watching depending on your local interest, if you have livestock, agricultural interests, whatever. And then we kind of back off as we get towards the end of the month with closer to average temperatures or slightly cooler, more likely. Cooler conditions are most likely throughout the rest of the growing season. August and through the rest of the growing season throughout the north, it's the most likely scenario as we're seeing at this point. With the very wet conditions, that would be an impact, and some of the models are also sticking with that. Wetter than average chances are more likely further west in the region, as we mentioned earlier. And, but the precipitation is going to be backing off enough right now that we're going to be draining, evaporating, and drying some of the wetter areas. Ag conditions generally look like they're going to stay pretty good unless we were to shut off completely. And then the El Nino does appear to be likely impending, which is reflected in the wintertime outlooks. Okay, just a reminder of our partners, a number of different websites, access to different information. So please visit them and make use of them. And thank you very much. Just a reminder of all of our contacts and friends and partners in this venture. And I'll take any questions that you have right now, or if there's anything you'd like me to explain further. We also have Kevin Stom from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Jim Angel from the Illinois State Climatologist here to provide additional information if needed.
Thank you, Dennis. And if you'd like to ask a question, just hit *6 on your phone, and that will unmute your phone so you could ask your question. And then to mute again, it will be *6. Okay, thank you, and the floor is open.
Yes, may I ask a question, please?
Go ahead, Bryce.
Okay, hello, Dennis. Bryce Anderson from DTN. Dennis, today
to unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
Through in Texas, a little bit north into Kansas. Could I get your thoughts on this as it relates to that Pacific?
To unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
There may be a little bit of an El Nino-ish type of factor in what we're seeing.
You ask a very good question, and I don't have a very good answer. Partially, I think the activity down there has been related to probably the edge of this cooler air that we've seen over us that has shoved the jet further south, been able to tap into some moisture down there. You know, El Nino does present some different paths along there. I guess I can't say, I'd still be reluctant to say that this is very El Nino-ish, but it is a possibility. I don't know if anybody else wanted to contribute on that or not, or had thoughts.
Thank you, Dennis. This is John. And Bryce, yeah, I think one of the main things that's holding us back right now with getting any more impacts with El Nino, or for the Climate Prediction Center saying this is an El Nino, is they are not seeing any changes in the atmospheric patterns yet. In other words, there should be a certain type of winds or regimes kind of setting up across the tropics, and they're just not seeing that. And
you're talking about the SOI, correct, John?
Yeah, the SOI. Well, it would be any number of them, but basically it would be that we're just not seeing what we would see, either surface winds or higher level winds that are being affected yet. So we're not seeing really that impact to the atmosphere yet. Until we start seeing that, I think that's why they're kind of holding back, I think, a lot too. That they're trying to keep it as an El Nino watch, but they haven't gone to a full advisory yet.
Also, with the kind of forecast in the outlook that has the below normal temperatures in the north, and knowing that is where the growing degree day totals and everything have been, the least because of the way things have been. Are you concerned about the chance for an early frost or even a normal frost causing some issues at the end of the growing season?
Yeah, good question, Bryce. Right now, we don't have any thoughts that we would see any kind of an early freeze. This far out, we really would be reluctant to say anything like that. Certainly, I have some concerns, and particularly in northern areas. Even if you were having an average freeze, with cooler conditions, we will probably, we may have some areas that are not mature yet, or certainly we would have some things that had not reached a level of dryness where people would like to see them. For those of you that don't follow agriculture closely, if crops are harvested that are too wet, they either have to be dried, or you can take them to the elevator and you lose some profits because they've able to dock you some pricing because of that. And crop prices have taken a bit of a dip now, so people would be like to save as much money as possible and not have to deal with the drying issue. So certainly, North Dakota, Minnesota, and parts of Michigan and Wisconsin, this is something we have to watch very closely. If that cool area does hang over the whole Corn Belt for that whole time, it might dip a little bit further south, but I'm reluctant to say that at this point. It's just the places that are further north that are far enough behind, that's one I would be watching very carefully.
Okay, thank you, Dennis.
And I like just tag on to Dennis's comment there too, and it kind of looks in the next 2 to 4 weeks or so, about 3-4 weeks, that we're going to get pretty much a good warm-up especially after this weekend. Finally, it's the Midwest, especially the plains, are going to get pretty hot pretty fast.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Other questions?
Just a reminder, it's *6 to unmute your phone. Well, one last call for questions.
I can't have covered everything well enough that way.
Well, in any case, you do have our phone numbers on the screen and also our email, so please feel free to give us a call or drop us a note, and we'll get right back with you, try to answer your questions or provide any data you might need. Yes, go ahead.
We certainly welcome comments or suggestions about these webinars at any time also.
That's right. Well, thank you, Dennis, for your work and your briefing today. Sure appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next month. Take care now. Bye-bye.